right, we're in the final stages here. Chapter 18, property management. We're at the very last chapter of the broker course, almost to the finish line before testing and the day of doom. Property management is something dear to my heart, something that I don't like at all, something that I will never do myself. We do have property management division, but I would rather pay somebody to manage my own properties because there's an emotional level that goes along with tenant-landlord situations that sometimes we get over involved in, and we don't realize that by trying to help somebody else, we're actually hurting ourselves. So I like to hire out property management. I will manage property for others, but I don't want to manage property for myself. It's just one of my things. We have this big blank slide here about the Florida Landlord and Tenant Act. There's basically saying that we have to observe these, and there's 3 parts of this act. So we skipped that slide. I'm not sure why they used one whole slide for this, but there's 3 parts of this, right? The 3 parts are non-residential tenancies in part 1. Part 2 is residential tenancies. And part 3 is self-storage space. So self-storage space involves real estate, so guess what? It's part 3 of this Landlord-Tenant Act, right? So part 1, an unwritten lease is a tenancy at will, right? Tenancy at will, we talked about different types of tenancies. We talked about tenancy at will, we talked about tenancy for years, estate for years, talked about tenancy at sufferance, right? Termination of tenancy at will. An unwritten lease means I can terminate that lease at any time with no penalties, right? Tenancy at will means I can do whatever I want at my will. If you hold over and you're living at this place without a lease, then it's called tenancy at sufferance. Why? Because one of the parties is suffering here, right? If you were to terminate that lease, then the landlord suffers, right? If the landlord terminates your lease, then you're suffering, right? So that's why I say tenancy at sufferance is easy to remember, because one party is suffering, or one party has the ability to make the other person suffer based on actions. The right of possession would change based on default and rent, right? So right of possession, the landlord gets the right of possession if the tenant doesn't pay, right? This is non-residential. We're talking commercial properties here, right? If the commercial property tenant doesn't pay, we have that right of possession. Landlords lien for rent, we can lien on them. Distress for rent, trial, verdict, judgment. This is talking about going to trial if we have to sue somebody on a lien, right? And then causes of eviction. So we can waive the right to proceed with the eviction claim, right? The tenant can. Or we can remove the tenant via judgment, right? So this is commercial landlord, tenant, and then we have residential. There's different requirements because you're dealing with somebody's homestead on a residential transaction, right? You're putting somebody on the street. Yeah, if you have a company, you're putting them out on the street, theoretically, but they don't live there. You're not actually not having a roof over their head, right? So there's different duties that are required as a landlord and as a tenant based on state law. This is statutory duties here. These are your legal rights and responsibilities, right? Tenant remedies a breach by landlord. Tenancy, they usually have a security deposit or some type of advanced rent, right? So if the tenant has an advanced rent and decides to quit paying the lease, the landlord takes that rent, uses it, and applies it while they're starting the eviction process to move you out, right? The landlord does have the right to reasonably enter the premises, the property, during the lease term, right? You need to have something in writing that says, hey, I can show up X number of hours in advance, right? So in the state of Florida, the requirement for notice is 12 hours, okay? Everybody says 24 hours because if you're gonna get somebody notice at 9 p.m. and show up at 9 a.m., it's not really fair, right? But 12 hours is the legal requirement. If you say change the air filters once a month, you put in your lease, I'll be by to change the air filter once a month, you can show up and change the air filter 1 month. In the event of an emergency, a fire, a flood, something like this, you have the right to enter the property without notice, right? Because you have to protect your property. Eviction proceedings have their right. You have to post your 3-day notice, go through the right processes to get to payment before you can just evict somebody and put them on the street. There's a process that has to go into effect. All right, so then we have, this is also part of part 2, right? Manager of single family homes or duplexes must provide working smoke detectors, right? Most people are doing combined smoke detector, carbon monoxide detectors nowadays. Manager of dwelling other than single family homes or duplexes must provide pest control. So if you're managing multifamily, you have to provide pest control. Why? Because pests will go through the walls and different people live differently, right? You have to provide locks and keys, change, clean and safe common areas, garbage removal, heat, and hot water. Notice it doesn't say hot water heater, it just says hot water, right? Because there's no such thing as a hot water heater.
I make that mistake all the time.
So we have water heaters out here, but we don't have hot water. Because the water's already hot, you don't heat hot water, okay? Landlords manage the premises, right? Here's the 12-hour notice, unless there's an emergency. That's what I was talking about. If you have a flood or a fire or some other emergency, you need to get into that house, that's the reason. Showing up and saying, I need to use the bathroom is not an emergency, right? You're allowed to inspect, make repairs, or show the apartment or single family home. So then we have legal responsibilities around security deposits, right? When a tenant vacates the premises, a landlord has 2 things that have to happen when it comes to security deposits. We have to return the deposit if there's no dispute on that deposit within 15 days. 15 days. 15 days to return a security deposit once the tenant vacates and it's in good condition. If the tenant vacates and leaves holes in your walls, rips up your carpet, takes out your air conditioner, does anything they're not supposed to do, you have to notify the tenant within 30 days to your intent to retain part of the security deposit or all of the security deposit. If we fail to notify the tenant within 30 days that we intend to keep part of that security deposit, then we can't keep the security deposit. We have to give it back to the tenant. You notice if we're taking a portion of it, we don't have to release it to them in 30 days. We just have to notify them that we intend to keep part of it. So what is a broker's role in property management? So the broker is the single agent of the absentee owner. So typically, we're not transaction brokers in property management situations. We are single agents because we're working for the landlord. Right? If it's an absentee owner, we're basically functioning as the landlord, right? You're probably not even talking to them at all. Deposits and rents are in trust. They go in some type of escrow account. Sales associates must deliver those funds in guess how many business days? No. 1 business day for sales associates, 3 business days for brokers, right? It's the same thing as escrow for operating accounts, for purchase and sale agreements. The difference is on the escrow account, the broker can place up to $5,000 of their own funds in a brokerage escrow account to account for fees. How much is allowed in an operating brokerage account? Do you remember? From chapter 2?
5?
1,000. 1,000 in a escrow account for operating, 5,000 in a property management escrow account, or if you have a combined escrow account, you can only have 1,000. The thing is 1,000 most people would say, well, why would I want to put 1,000 in a combined account? You shouldn't. You should have 2 separate escrow accounts, in my opinion. But you can. So then we have all these federal laws around fair housing, right? Because back in 1866, Civil Rights Act says that we can't discriminate for housing, right? Discriminate for race. 1866 is race only. And then we had the Fair Housing Act in 1968 that added all those other ones on there, that the acronym, if you remember, was Fresh Corn. Race, color, religion, sex, national origin, handicap, familial status. Those are the protected classes under the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And the ADA Act prohibits discrimination not only for housing, but it also for employment and public common use area must be accessible for handicapped persons, including parking. How many spots out of 25?
1.
1. Minimum. Can have more, just can't have less. So we have different types of management, right? We have property management firms. We have brokerages that specialize in management that have a high level of experience, right? This is all they do day in and day out. It's kind of like a mortgage broker. A mortgage broker specializes in mortgages. They don't sell savings accounts and credit cards, right? Property management firm is also not working in property sales. They're working directly with tenants and landlords day in and day out every day. Then you have this thing called in-house management staff. One of my friends works for in-house management staff. You manage single-family homes, or you manage apartment complex as a leasing agent or as a property manager. Large companies hire and train their own staffs and keep them on staff. And then there's the individual broker that will manage their properties. They sell themselves, right? They set up their property management division of their company. A lot of small brokers do this. Even some of the larger brokers do this and have a property management division that they refer business back and forth to sales and tenant landlord situations. So do we have to have a license to be a property manager? Well, there's some exceptions, as always, right? People who rent their own properties can rent their own properties without a license. They can also write their own leases without a law license, right? Because they're doing it for themselves. If you're renting it for somebody else or you're managing it for somebody else, you're not preparing that lease for them and you're not managing that property without a license. Employees of corporations renting corporate property who are paid salary. Again, we're talking about how are we paid. If we're paid salary, we don't have to have a license, right? If we're paid bonus, commission, or anything else, we have to have a license. If it's transactionally based, we have to have a license. Salaried employees who work in an on-site office, same thing. There's nothing but salary here. We don't have to have a license. Salary managers are condominiums who rent units for no more than a year. Again, we don't have a license. We're paid salary. It's a common denominator here. Persons who rent property for transient occupancy under Florida Statute 509. Persons renting homes and renting lots and mobile home parks. Renting lots, you're not renting anything. It's not really a residential issue. It is residential, but it's not the same capacity as somebody having a roof over there, because the people are bringing their own roof over their head. Property management markets, so we have office buildings, retail stores, and then we have residential, right? Residential is comprised of single-family, multifamily condos, and vacation rentals. Community associations, homeowners association, right? A community association is when homeowners association is required. Deed restricted communities. If this association is allowed to put a fee on there, those deed restricted communities. CAMs are required if it's more than 10 units or more than $100,000 budget, right? So if you have an 8-unit apartment complex with a $100,000 budget or $150,000 budget, for example, you have to have a CAM, right? If you have a 4-unit neighborhood with $150,000 budget, you have to have a CAM, right? If you have a 20-unit development with a $10,000 budget, you have to have a CAM, right? It only has to have one or the other, it doesn't have to have both. That CAM has to be licensed, the community association manager has to be licensed with the Department of Business Professional Regulation. So you can't say, well, I'm just going to turn the HOA over to my neighborhood if there's not a CAM to run it, because I guarantee you, your neighborhood with 150 homes has a $600 association fee every month is way higher than a $100,000 budget. Evaluating rental market. So what do we do when we evaluate the rental market and property management? We've talked a little bit about this already, right? We look at the demographics and economic information for the area. We're doing neighborhood market analysis, right? We're checking boundaries and transportation economy and looking at supply and demand. We're looking at all these factors to see what the value of the rental property would be, right? And what's in the neighborhood? Is it a neighborhood with a lot of amenities, a lot of shopping, a lot of access to everything somebody might need, or is it somewhere out in rural area where there's 10 miles before you get to the closest convenience store, right? These things are going to affect how much you get for your property. As a property manager, we're also going to do inspections. We're going to go in and do an exterior inspection. Are the eaves falling apart? Is there termite damage on the outside of the house? Are the driveways cracked and have a slip and fall hazard, stuff like that, right? We're going to check for this deferred maintenance. Interior inspection, see if somebody put holes in the walls, see if the carpet's ripped up, see if there was a flood that we didn't know about, stuff like that. And then we're going to compare these properties to other properties that are similar, right? If we have an average condition home and we have another average condition home and they're the same size, the theory is they're going to get about the same amount of rent. Property size, right? And then we're going to advertise. Advertising is a broker activity. We talked about that as one of the AVAR sales, right? Signs and billboards, internet, social media. Most of the advertising today is gone towards internet and social media. We have newspapers, apartment guides. Again, these are losing favor in the world because everybody's online, right? Broadcast media, so it could be on the radio, it could be on TV. And then we have direct mailing, right? It says here a good mailing list is key to success. Well, when you're talking about today's advertising versus 10 years ago's advertising, everything's gone online type advertising. So a lot of the other stuff is kind of obsolete at this point. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't know about it. We should just take that with a grain of salt. How do we show property? Right? So we have rental agents, we have leasing agents, we have people that only show property for commission, whatever the case is. We want to qualify that prospect. If we show the property, we don't want to show it to somebody who can't qualify for that property. Do they have at least a decent credit report? Do they have enough income to satisfy the requirements of that owner, right? Those are the things we need to know. Are they somebody that has 6 different rental properties in the last 4 years? It might be somebody you want to look into a little bit closer. Or is it somebody that stayed in the same house for 7 years, 8 years? Create that interest, right? This is telling you don't show too many units, but sometimes people want to see as many as they can so that they can get an idea of what they want, right? But we shouldn't be showing people 50 rental units. There might be a one-off, but most of the time that's not the case, right? Give the prospect enough time to show that property. Don't walk in the house and say, oh, I don't like it, walk out 5 seconds, right? Give them 20 minutes to walk around if they need to look around. And our job as agents is to handle objections. That's always our job, is to handle objections. Valid objections means showing other units, right? So if it's an objection that you don't like, maybe you don't want to be in the back of the neighborhood because you're scared about safety or whatever, and you don't want to be out of the spotlight, right? That might be a valid objection for somebody that, say, single, younger, whatever the case is, right? But sometimes objection is just something that somebody's bringing up so they can maybe try and negotiate a price, right? They don't necessarily not like something, they just are bringing something up to try to get a better deal. Tenant policies, so this is just talking about making sure people understand their rules, what they have to do. This is where you might see a test question here. Tenant complaints, most tenant complaints are from service, right? They're not responding to my air conditioner request quick enough. Oh, my plumbing's been locked up for a week, something like that, right? If it's not the owner's responsibility, then it's our job to tell them that the tenant needs to handle that piece of the puzzle, right? Second, the tenant complaints for services, parking, noise, right? People complain about that, right? Not only complaints of the tenants on the neighbors, but also on the neighbors on the tenants. The neighbors will call and say, hey, your tenants are playing the music too loud, right? This is a common thing. It definitely ranks high. Sanitation as well. People don't take care of a rented property as well as they take care of their own property. A lot of times people that are renting don't care about the deferred maintenance. They'll just let the property go to trash, and then you're here to clean up the mess, right, as a property manager. Some of the things you're going to run into. Now, what happens if the tenant doesn't pay? Do on the first, late on the second, post a 3-day notice, right? Post a 3-day notice. Do on the first, late on the second, post a 3-day notice. You could be late, you could give people a 5-day grace period. The more time you give people to hang themselves, the easier for them to hang themselves, and the harder it is for them to dig themselves out of the hole. If you give them a 3-day notice right away, you're starting the eviction process right away, it gives them the opportunity to catch up before it's too late. You're actually doing them a favor. So first thing you do is you give a 3-day notice to vacate. The landlord gives a notice to vacate, but you're not allowed to change locks, you're not allowed to remove doors, you're not allowed to cut the power off or the water off. You can't do anything like this, because if you do that, you can get sued. After the 3-day notice and you haven't been paid, now you can file a complaint with the court systems. Getting it through the court and getting a final judgment, you get this writ of possession. What is a writ of possession? It's a judgment saying you have the right to possess the property at this point. You hire the sheriff's office, you bring the sheriff in, you put the people's stuff at the curb, and you tell them that they can go. It does not take 30 days in the state of Florida to evict a tenant. But know that you have to give a 3-day notice, know that you are not allowed to change the locks, you're not allowed to cut the power off, and you have to go through the process of getting that judgment so that you can get the right people in the right place to get the people out. So then there's all these different clauses you can have in a lease, right? You can list the appliances that are on property, what stays, what goes, what advance rent's required, if a deposit's required and what the late charge would be, what you're allowed to use the property for, what you're not allowed to use the property for, like cooking meth, for example, right? Who's responsible for utilities and maintenance? Is there a copay? What happens if they default? Can they catch it up? And what the terms of the actual lease are. These are things that are standard in leases. Sometimes people put other things. Hey, I'll give you $50 off if you're willing to mow the grass, right? Hey, if you pay in full every month for 5 months, I'll give you $100 off. Something like that. You could do whatever you want. You could do whatever you want if you're doing your leases, right? And it's some type of maintenance program, right? Structural integrity. Roof is going to deteriorate over time. We need to reserve for replacement. So maybe a piece of that goes towards it. We need to make sure that they're required to keep the plants off the walls, for example, so that it doesn't rot the walls out quicker, right? If the tenant doesn't change the air filter, then you can make them responsible for any AC service that they might need, right? Because it's causing extra strain on the property. You can put all these things in your lease, right? Plumbing and electric. Maybe the first plumbing call if they find out that a kid dropped a block down the drain, then the tenant's responsible for that, right? Electrical systems, so they're overloading outlets and blowing fuses all the time. Like these things, if it's something that the tenant is causing, you can have a clause in there to say that they are required to have good functional performance of things, and they have to hold things in up to a higher level of standards, or they can pay for the damages. Housekeeping, clean and well maintained. Look, everybody has a mess at their house at one point or another. What we're talking about here is filthiness. What we're talking about here is taking the trash out. Normal, everyday stuff that people do. Sometimes people don't do that. I've seen houses that you wouldn't believe in this business. Some people don't even take their dogs outside to use the bathroom. Ever. Merchandising, carpet replacement, decorating, landscaping, so all these things have to be taken into consideration for a property manager, right? We have certain maintenance programs. Maybe we charge an extra fee because we're going to do this every time we lease a house, right? And then we have different types of maintenance, right? We have a maintenance staff, right? So if I have an on-site property manager or an on-site maintenance crew, it might be cheaper for me to do that than to have somebody to contract out every time. It might also be quicker. I can get a response out there quicker. If it's somebody that's on staff, a lot of times it's easier to schedule and have an inspection done because you can just have somebody come the day it's needed, right? And then we have security. We also have security in place in some places. Not every place, but a lot of places have rental security. So that's kind of the maintenance piece of the property. Obviously, if you're running a property management side, you have to have some type of record keeping, right? Budgets, operations, managers organize records and retain records. They keep licensing reports. They do all the paperwork, right? I'm not going to sit here and read every single one of these, but they do all the paperwork. They're making sure that our records are up to date and that the payments and the books are on point. That's what they're doing. Accounting and record keeping. Risk management, we're identifying risk. What are the property risks? Do we have aggressive breeds of dogs? Do we have enough security? Do we have enough lighting? We're transferring risk as much as possible to the occupying parties, making them buy insurance or giving them hold harmless agreements or having outside contractors. Outside contractors should have their own liability insurance. Transferring that risk to somebody else, right? So a way of mitigating costs, mitigating problems. We talked about different types of risk, right? We had static risk. Remember what static risk was? Fire, theft, flooding, right? We're protecting that with what? Insurance, right? We have dynamic risk, which is your economic tax code changes, etc., right? You can't insure dynamic risk, you can only insure static risk. And we have financial risk. We talked about this earlier, right? Mortgage payments could increase, which would make the property more risky if you have a mortgage, right? The investment more risky. Property manager should also check for active policies, right? We should know this already. Policies should cover a bunch of things, right? If it's somebody that has commercial vehicles, we have to make sure that the vehicles are insured. If it's somebody that has a lot of employees, we need to make sure we have workers' compensation. We need to have a fidelity policy if somebody were to steal something. Fire, flood, and loss of income as well, right? We have short-term insurance plans if somebody was out of work for a while. See that bottom line says property manager should be insured or should be one of the additional insured in the owner's insurance because the property manager might be handling your claims and sometimes they don't want to talk to the third party. So some type of third-party authorization, right? Owner management relationship, and that's really important for single-family absentee owners because why? If they're out of town, they may not get them for a while. If they're overseas owners, they may not get them for a while. They may be on different time schedules. Owner management relationship, right? Management agreement, compensation for services. So these are what we have to put in our management agreement, right? We have a property management agreement that a real estate brokerage has. It tells you what kind of communication you have to have. It tells you what we need to evaluate for performance. It tells you if we need to advertise. It tells you what type of agreement we have for holding escrow, it tells you everything about maintenance, who's gonna be responsible for contracting out help, all this stuff is in your manager-owner relationship. Now, as far as staffing and employing, it's a little different things, right? If you're doing that side of it, then what is the job description that's required for these people? What kind of training are you gonna give them? How are we gonna recruit and retrain personnel, right? These are the things that are important for the management side of the business if you have a staff of the property manager. Right? And that's it.